There are stories from ancient Egypt that challenge not only modern values, but the very definition of family power and madness. This is not a legend, but a historical record. A queen who married her brother, and then her own son. Her name was Cleopatra II, a woman born into divine blood and dynastic obsession. And what happened behind her palace walls still chills historians today. So buckle in as we descend into one of the darkest royal bloodlines ever recorded. And if twisted royal tales and forgotten dynasties fascinate, you don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment to let me know where you're watching from. Let's uncover this scandal history tried to bury. She was not the Cleopatra you've heard of, not the seductress who captivated Rome, but one who ruled a century earlier. She was a queen, forged not in romance, but in ritual, not in seduction, but in sacrifice. Born around 185 years before Christ, Cleopatra II was the daughter of Ptolemy V, and Cleopatra I herself, a Seleucid princess. From the moment of her birth, her blood was destiny, royal, sacred, contained. It was said to descend from the gods themselves, and so it had to remain pure, even if that meant folding back into itself like a snake devouring its tail. The practice was called sacred marriage, a ritual union between royal siblings, mimicking the divine couple, Isis and Osiris. But beneath the symbolism, the reality was more suffocating than sacred. At the age of 12, Cleopatra was married to her brother Ptolemy VI. The wedding was public. The vow was ceremonial. But the fear was private, hidden beneath layers of linen perfume and gold. It was a marriage not of choice, but of calculation. A sacrifice dressed as duty. A tradition whispered down through generations like a curse. In the golden halls of Alexandria, the marble floors gleamed. The columns were carved with lotus and falcon, but behind every column stood a silence too deep for childhood. Cleopatra II would grow into power, into motherhood, into rulership. But her foundation was cracked from the start, because the blood that made her queen was the same blood that would one day betray her. The dynasty that ruled Egypt in Cleopatra II's time was not Egyptian by blood, but by throne, by image, and by theater. The Ptolemies were Macedonian Greeks, descendants of one of Alexander the Great's generals. And though they wore the crowns of the pharaohs and painted themselves in divine gold, their kingdom was built on contradiction. They spoke Greek in private, they prayed in Egyptian temples, and they married their siblings. To rule Egypt was to imitate the gods. And in Egyptian mythology there was no greater model than Isis and Osiris, a sacred pair who were sister and brother, wife and husband. By echoing this myth in their own marriages, the Ptolemies believed they sanctified their power. It was not incest, they claimed, it was divine imitation. But to the children caught in this imitation, it was no myth. It was a cage. Cleopatra II was born into this myth, raised inside Alexandria's grand palace complex, a glittering maze of gardens, colonnades, perfumed halls, and polished floors, where priests, scholars, and eunuchs whispered behind closed doors. Her earliest memories would have been shaped by ceremony daily offerings to falcon-headed gods, rituals of purification, and the subtle grooming of a girl who was never her own. From the outside, she lived in beauty. From within, she lived in containment. When she came of age, her brother Ptolemy VI became her husband. Their wedding was a public declaration of divine unity. A parade of incense-bearers, harpists, and sacred dancers walked them beneath the columns of the Temple of Isis. Gold dust was blown over their heads. Scribes etched their names together onto scrolls and stone. Together they ruled as a sacred pair, king and queen, husband and wife, brother and sister. But even as their thrones stood side by side, their hearts drifted in opposite directions. Ptolemy VI was cautious, hesitant, shaped by advisors who feared instability. Cleopatra II, meanwhile, was more direct, more ambitious. She had seen how women in her line could wield power, how a queen could be both vessel and weapon. Their rule was not without tension. Factions grew around them. Greek elites, native Egyptians, temple priests, mercenaries from abroad. And behind every formal gesture was the quiet knowledge that their bloodline had begun to eat itself. The problem with marrying your brother was not just political. It was biological. Each generation was more fragile than the last. Mental instability disease and early death haunted the dynasty like a shadow that grew with every wedding feast. But the pressure never let up. After all, the gods demanded incest. And so when Cleopatra II gave birth to her children, they too were not simply heirs. They were future spouses, future pawns, future ghosts. For a time she endured. She bore children. She wore the double crown. She sat beside her brother at ceremonies and watched statues raised in their honor. To the world, she was the mother of Egypt, the new Isis. But beneath the gold, the cracks had begun to form, and soon the entire illusion would collapse. The illusion could not last. Not even under gold ceilings and sacred titles. Not even when sealed with priestly chants or wrapped in silken lineage. The marriage between Cleopatra II and her brother-husband Ptolemy VI began to fracture, not from within their chamber, but from the grinding weight of empire. Syria circled like a vulture. Rome hovered like a god with a knife. And within Egypt's borders, loyalties buckled under centuries of conquest. The Nile still rose. The temples still stood. But the people no longer believed the palace could protect them. When war broke out between Egypt and the Seleucid Empire, the very land of Cleopatra II's mother, it was her own family who became the enemy. Her uncle Antiochus IV invaded Egypt under the guise of guardianship. In truth, it was conquest, masked as kinship. The royal siblings were torn apart. Ptolemy VI was captured. The throne teetered, and Cleopatra II, no longer the ceremonial queen, but a ruler in crisis, took command. She turned to her younger brother Ptolemy VIII, a man known for his cunning, his cruelty, and his appetite for power. To save the kingdom, the three siblings formed a temporary triumvirate. They ruled together, sister, brother, brother, a grotesque triangle of authority, where every decision bled distrust. But ambition does not tolerate sharing, and Ptolemy VIII did not want to be third. He wanted all. Not long after Ptolemy VI died. The cause remains uncertain, some whisper war wounds, others assassination. But with his death, a vacuum opened, one that Ptolemy VIII wasted no time filling. And then, he married his sister. Cleopatra II, widowed once, now bound again to blood. This second marriage was no revival of divine order. It was a silent war, cloaked in wedding robes. Their union was a performance, and Cleopatra knew it. But she had no choice. To preserve the throne, to keep her children alive, she had to remain at the heart of power, even if that power turned against her. At first they ruled together, publicly united, privately hollow. But when Ptolemy VIII took Cleopatra's daughter, the girl she had raised in the shadow of incense and iron, and made her his wife, the spiral truly began. Not only had he married his niece, he had married his stepdaughter. He had ripped the girl from her mother's side and used her as leverage, as provocation, as punishment. Then came the act that history has never forgiven. In one of the most brutal and symbolic gestures of ancient power, Ptolemy VIII murdered Cleopatra's son, Ptolemy Memphites, and sent the dismembered corpse to her in a box. It arrived during a public festival. The queen was meant to smile for the people. Instead, she opened the package and found her child's remains. That was the moment, the fracture that could not be hidden. The queen collapsed, not just as a mother, but as a monarch, a myth, a woman turned into a state symbol. Something inside her broke not like a crack, but like a temple imploding from within. She would not forget. She would not forgive. And from the blood of her son, she began to plot a war not against foreign invaders, but against her own husband. She had ruled as a goddess. Now she plotted as a mother. The public still called her Cleopatra, the second daughter of the gods' queen of the two lands. But behind closed doors, in candle-lit chambers, thick with incense and grief, she was no longer queen. She was a woman in mourning, a mother robbed, a sovereign betrayed in her own palace, and the people watched. The murder of Ptolemy Memphis, her son, sent Egypt spiraling. It was not just a crime, it was a blasphemy. The royal family, once masked in divine symbols, now reeked of blood and rot. Whispers filled the streets of Alexandria that the king had desecrated the sacred order, that Cleopatra was being held like a hostage, that the Nile itself would turn against such crimes. But Ptolemy VIII did not fear whispers. He welcomed them. He tightened his grip on the court, on the temples, on Cleopatra herself. He filled the palace with foreign mercenaries. He purged advisors. He rewrote sacred texts to exalt his own name above all others. And most of all, he erased her voice. Cleopatra II, once co-ruler, was now ceremonial a figurehead, draped in mourning silks. Her decrees were overturned, her allies disappeared, her image removed from coins, but her silence was not surrender. In secret, she reached out to generals, governors, priests. She gathered those disillusioned with the king's cruelty. And in the year 131 before Christ, Cleopatra launched a rebellion. It began in Thebes, where the priesthood still revered her as the living Isis. Then Hermopolis, Abydos, and stretches of Upper Egypt followed. City by city, Egypt rose not against foreign conquest, but against its own throne. It was a civil war of blood and kin, a war of mother against husband, of queen against king. For nearly 4 years, Cleopatra held control of the south. She minted her own coins. She declared herself sole pharaoh. And for a moment it seemed as though the gods might favor her after all. But Ptolemy VIII was not finished. He retreated to Cyprus and plotted a return. When he landed in Alexandria once more, it was not with forgiveness, but fire. He unleashed brutality. His enemies were dismembered, burned fed to crocodiles. Children were slaughtered in the streets. Entire lineages erased. It was called a cleansing, but history remembers it as a massacre. And Cleopatra, she vanished, not killed, not imprisoned, simply gone. Her supporters believed she had been hidden by loyal priests, perhaps spirited away into Nubia, or sheltered in a necropolis deep beneath the sands. Others claimed she had gone mad from grief, wandering the temples at night, speaking to her dead children as if they lived. But the truth is simpler. She was erased, not just from the throne, but from records, from rituals, from memory itself. For nearly a decade, Cleopatra II disappeared from Egypt's official history. Her name scratched off temple walls, her titles revoked, her children, if any remained, silenced. And still the bloodline continued. Because while one queen vanished, another rose, Cleopatra III, the daughter who had been forced to marry her own uncle, the man who murdered her brother. It was not justice. It was dynasty. In Egypt, gods could die, temples could fall, but the Ptolemies would persist even if the cost was unbearable. And for Cleopatra II, the price had just begun. She returned like a ghost, not announced, not celebrated, simply present again. After nearly a decade, lost to silence, Cleopatra II emerged from the shadows of exile. No inscription explains where she had been. No priestly scroll recounts the pain she endured. But when she returned to Alexandria, her eyes were not those of a queen. They were the eyes of a woman who had buried too much. By this time, the throne had changed. Her once husband and eternal enemy, Ptolemy VIII, now ruled side by side with Cleopatra III, her own daughter. The same daughter who had been married off to him as a political prize. The same daughter who had stood between her and justice. To the public, their reunion was framed as a miracle of forgiveness, a return to unity. Mother-daughter and king ruling together in harmony. But behind the mosaics and incense, the truth twisted like smoke. Cleopatra II was not returning to power. She was returning to complete a ritual of survival. Her son Ptolemy Memphites had been killed and mutilated, but another remained. His name was Ptolemy, the Memphite, sometimes confused in records, sometimes deliberately. A son, perhaps a nephew, perhaps a symbol conjured for political resurrection. The bloodlines blurred so thoroughly that even historians struggle to trace the bodies behind the names. But what is known is this: to reclaim stability, Cleopatra II married her son. It was not a wedding of joy. There were no lyres or lotus petals. The ceremony was not sung in verse, but whispered in dread. To many, it was the logical conclusion of Ptolemaic tradition, sibling marriage cousin unions, blood twining back upon itself like ivy around a tomb. But this time, the ritual felt different. She had once married her brother. Now she married the child of her womb. It was not about love. It was about legacy. It was about retaking the throne in a way that no enemy, not even Ptolemy VIII, could undo without implicating himself further in a kingdom already drenched in scandal. The ceremony was brief. The silence was long. People watched, but no one cheered. The scribes recorded it but left out the details. Priests gave blessings with trembling hands. Even the gods, it seemed, looked away. What did that boy think as he stood beside the mother who had become his bride? Was he old enough to understand? Was he broken before he even had a chance to live? No one asked. No one dared. Because in Alexandria, the palace was no longer a home of glory. It was a mausoleum of the living, a place where crowns were forged from compromise and survival. And Cleopatra II wore hers like a shroud. After the wedding, she re-entered rule not as a sovereign, but as a relic, a reminder of Egypt's decline into madness. Together with her daughter and her son-husband, she formed a new triumvirate. 3 generations bound not by blood, but by ruin. They ruled together in silence. They dined beside statues of the dead. They slept beneath ceilings painted with gods who had long since abandoned them. And through it all, Cleopatra II endured, not because she was strong, but because she had nothing else to lose. This was her climax, not a triumph, not a return, but a performance of power so corrupted, so decayed, that even victory tasted like dust. History calls her a ruler, but by the end, she was more a ruin, a moving monument to everything her dynasty had cost. Cleopatra II remained in the palace, but she no longer walked as a sovereign. She drifted pale and draped in ceremonial silks like a priestess who had forgotten her gods. Her name still appeared beside laws. Her likeness still adorned temple walls. But her spirit had vanished somewhere between betrayal and survival. She had outlived 2 husbands, one of whom had dismembered her son. She had outlasted Civil War exile and humiliation. She had even returned to rule only to marry her own child in a desperate act of political restoration. But there are some things no crown can repair, and Cleopatra, once a symbol of divinity, was now a living echo, tolerated, not feared. The palace of Alexandria had changed. The gardens where she once walked as a girl were overgrown. The halls had been repainted, but the blood beneath the tiles still whispered. Her daughter Cleopatra III wielded true power, now clever, calculating, and deeply aware that her mother's continued presence was both threat and shield. Together, the 2 Cleopatras reigned mother and daughter, queen and queen. But behind the walls, their alliance was a mask. Cleopatra III had married her mother's killer. She had borne children by him. She had watched her brother die in a box, and still she remained. The dynasty endured because it refused to stop feeding on itself. For years, the 3-headed court persisted. Ptolemy VIII, bloated and paranoid, issuing decrees soaked in fear. Cleopatra III, cold-eyed and ambitious, raising new heirs to continue the cycle. Cleopatra II, older, now quieter, dressed in mourning, even when no one had died. She became a ghost in her own kingdom, a reminder of blood spilled, a mirror of what power really costs. When Ptolemy VIII finally died in his bed, not by blade, there was no celebration. only a reshuffling of seats at the royal table. His children with Cleopatra III took their places. Coins were struck with new faces. Statues shifted. But Cleopatra II remained. She lived on watching the world rebuild itself around her. She attended ceremonies in silence. She nodded at generals who once swore allegiance to her rebellion. She smiled at grandchildren who bore the same names as the sons she had lost. Some called it dignity, others madness. But what else could she do? She had given her body to the dynasty as sister wife, mother bride. She had stitched the crown back together with her own pain. And still she was not free. Because queens in Egypt were never allowed to simply disappear. They lingered in marble, in myths, in mourning. And so she remained. A woman without a voice. A queen without a soul. A mother with no more to bury. Not dead, not alive, but unerasable. No one recorded the moment Cleopatra II died. There was no grand funeral, no parade of priests or golden barks drifting down the Nile. She passed as quietly as she had endured, and history let her go. By the time her body was laid to rest, perhaps in Alexandria, perhaps in Memphis, the world had already moved on. New queens had risen. New children with old names walked the palace halls. Statues of Isis bore the faces of her granddaughters. The dynasty endured as it always had on the bones of the women who built it. But Cleopatra II was different. She had ruled longer than most of her ancestors. She had survived more betrayals than any queen of her time. She had married her brother. Then, her other brother. Then perhaps, her son. She had watched her family collapse into itself like a dying star. And still she had endured. That was her curse. Not death, but survival. For nearly 60 years, she remained bound to the throne through war, blood, incest, exile, return, and ritual humiliation. She outlived tyrants and children alike. And when she finally fell silent, the kingdom did not mourn. It exhaled. But her legacy was not forgotten. Tea was simply overshadowed. Because a century later, another Cleopatra would rise the seventh to bear the name. She would seduce Rome, defy emperors, and die by her own hand. And the world would remember her as the Cleopatra, the last queen of Egypt. But long before her, there was Cleopatra II, the queen who bled to keep the dynasty alive, the mother who held her son's bones in her lap, the woman who wore the crown as both shield and noose. Today, she is little more than a name on temple walls and crumbling coins. Her story buried under brighter myths, her suffering diluted in academic footnotes. But if you listen closely, her echo is still there in every cracked cartouche, in every erased inscription in the silence behind the legend. She was not a monster. She was not a saint. She was a mirror held up to a dynasty so obsessed with purity that it consumed itself. Her tomb, if it still exists, has never been found. But Egypt is full of unmarked graves, and somewhere beneath stone and dust, she waits not for resurrection, but for recognition. To be remembered not as a queen of incest, but as a woman crushed beneath the weight of divine blood.